Okay, this week our focus is on the Constitutional Convention and going from the Articles of Confederation, the original document for the United States government, to the Constitution. And for the 3 months that the delegates were in Philadelphia, there was a lot of agreement and disagreement and fighting and debate going back and forth between many parts of what will come to be a very successful Constitution. We're going to look at 3 of the most important compromises and make sure we know them for our assessment. First off, the question of on a lot of people's minds was, how are we going to select our representatives for the government? Under the Articles of Confederation, we know that there was one vote essentially for each state. This made getting things done very difficult. So the state of Virginia introduced the Virginia Plan, which basically says we should select our representatives based on population. The larger the state, the larger the population, the more representatives, therefore the more power and authority in this new Congress. Smaller states would be taken advantage by that. So New Jersey puts forth what's called the New Jersey Plan, the New Jersey Plan, which says that there should be equal representation, that each state should have equal votes, just like it was under the Articles of Confederation. So they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until finally Roger Sherman from the state of Connecticut offers a solution to the problem. What Roger Sherman suggests is that we have a 2-house legislature, a bicameral legislature. One of those houses would be the House of Representatives, where the representatives would be based on the population of the state. So larger states would have more representatives. A state like Virginia would have a large number of representatives compared to the state of New Jersey, which might have 2 or 3. This would give weight and power to the larger states. But we would also have a second house called the Senate. From the Senate, you would have 2 representatives from each state, no matter what the state's population or size. This would create a balance. The 2 houses would then have to work together to pass any laws. So you make the big states happy on one side by giving them larger representation in the House. You make the smaller states happy on the other side by giving them equal representation in the Senate. The Connecticut Compromise makes it work. Well, if we're going to decide our representatives based on population, then we need to ask the question, who do we count? Well, in terms of who's living in America, we have men, women, children, but we also have this very large slave population, and that becomes the issue. So northern representatives say, no, we don't count the slaves when we count the population because the slaves aren't citizens, they're essentially property. We don't count property when we count population. This would give the northern states a huge advantage in the new government. The southern states are terrified of this. They want the slaves to be counted. Without the slaves counted as part of their population, the southern states would have less representatives, less authority, and therefore less power. Not counting the slaves would give the northern states way more representatives. This is something the South can't possibly allow to happen. So the compromise becomes what's known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. So if you counted the population of a state, you would count only 3/5 of the total slave population. So for example, in New York, 100 people equals 100 people. But in the South, in a slave state, let's say like Atlanta, 100 slaves would only be counted as 60 people towards the total population of the state, which you would then use to figure out how much representatives. This makes the North happy because not all the slaves are being counted. And this makes the South happy because at least they get 2 or 3/5 of their slave population counted towards their representation in Congress. This will help create more of a balance between North and South. But we can already see that slavery is becoming a huge issue in the very initial stages of our country's history. This brings us to another issue regarding slavery. The question arises, well, what about the slave trade? So northern states, of course, want the slave trade stopped for numerous reasons that we're not really going to get into. The South says, of course, we need slavery to survive, so we need the slave trade to continue. The question and the debate becomes, when will this actually end, or are we going to allow it to continue? Important to note, this is the importation of slaves. This has nothing to do with slaves being bought and sold and traded throughout the states as they exist right now. This is simply the importation of slaves from overseas. So the compromise is made that the slave trade will end, but it will end in 20 years, giving southern states the time to adjust and to compensate for that. So this makes the North happy because the slave trade is going to end, and the South's at least okay with the fact that they've got 20 more years to import as many slaves as they can get their hands on. So the compromise will end the importation of slaves, but slave-free and the slave trade will still exist within the states themselves. And we can see that slavery is becoming a huge issue of debate between North and South. It's threatening to get in the way of the creation of the Constitution, and it's something that the country is going to continue to deal with all the way until 1861, when we have the start of the Civil War. So those are your 3 compromises. Make sure that you know them. Make sure you can explain them in some detail. So we have the Slave Trade Compromise, the 3/5ths Compromise, and the Connecticut Compromise.